You're listening to the Bail in the Midwest podcast.
Hello and welcome to the Bail in the Midwest podcast, where we explore a variety of topics related to bail, pretrial release, and the criminal justice system in the Midwest. My name is Shane Rolf. I'm the Executive Vice President of the Kansas Bail Agents Association, and I've worked in this field for the past 35 years. Today, we'll be discussing 10% bonds. This is a somewhat broad topic, as a 10% bond means different things to different people in different jurisdictions. At its foundation, a 10% bond simply refers to the amount a professional bail bondsman charges for his services. Most commonly, this fee is 10% of the full amount of the bond that the bondsman guarantees to the court to ensure that the defendant appears to answer the charges against him. While the concept of a bail bond surety dates back at least 1,000 years and is enshrined in the earliest documents of Old English common law, including the Magna Carta, and bail is referenced in Shakespeare, and there's actually even references in the Bible, the idea of a professional surety bail is a uniquely American construct and dates back about 150 years. And since the business of bail bonds involves dealing with the government, various government entities started looking at bail bonds as a source of revenue, not by simply collecting forfeitures when defendants absconded, but rather by essentially going into the bail bond business themselves. And so in 1964, in the state of Illinois, we see the creation of the 10% deposit bond. The court establishes a bond, and the defendant is allowed to post 10% deposit of 10% of that bond directly with the court. Theoretically, the defendant is responsible for the remaining 90% of that bond in the event of a failure to appear. In practice, that virtually never happens, and we'll talk more about these bonds later, but the 10% deposit bond is another option when you're referring to a 10% bond. Finally, a third reference for 10% bonds can be seen in the news today. In Houston, Texas, the local bail bond board, which oversees local bail bondsmen, established a new rule that requires a bail bond surety to collect the entire 10% fee up front and essentially establishes 10% as the fee, and disallows any sort of payment plan or financing of the bail bond fee for certain crimes. This is being loosely referred to as a 10% bond requirement. My guest today to discuss all of these topics has vast experience in the business of secured bail. Mike Whitlock is the Executive Vice President of American Surety Company, which has agents all over the country. Mike also maintains a current blog on the issue facing surety bail industry on the American Surety website. Mike, it's great to have you here today. It's been my longstanding, at least one episode tradition to let the guests toot their own horn. So if you can kind of give us some of your background in the bail bond business and all the great things you've done.
Well, thanks for having me on, Shane. Like you said, my name is Mike Whitlock with American Surety Company. I'm an executive vice president and partner here, and we're based in Indianapolis. I started in bail in 1982 in Dallas, just as a running bonds. I was right out of high school, so I'm in my 40th year in bail, and I just kind of moved up the ladder until we moved to Indianapolis in 1984, and I travel all over the country, see our agents all from California to New York, from Florida to Washington State. I'm in Washington State next week for the state association. So really have gotten to know a lot of good people all over the country. Bail agents have big hearts, and they're very interested in maintaining public safety in their own communities and providing services to those that really have a constitutional right to bail. And by getting them, making sure their clients get to court, they're doing their part in the criminal justice system, because if you don't have the defendant in court, quite simply, the case cannot move forward. So it's the bail agent has a very pivotal role in the criminal justice system.
And your company has, I believe I read, over 2,000 agents all across the country. So you have a pretty broad perspective on how these different jurisdictions work, I take it.
Yeah, that's a close number. I don't really keep track of the exact number every day, but we have a large number of appointed agents throughout the country. That's correct.
Okay, well, I think we can maybe work our way through some of these 10% deposit bond options. Maybe start with the Harris County situation. And I'll lay out a little background on this. Harris County has been a battleground on bail reform issues for as long as I can remember. And I haven't been in bail quite as long as you have, Micah, but getting close. Gerald Monks, who founded PBUS, the Professional Bail Agents in the United States, I believe he did so in response to early attempts at so-called bail reform in Harris County. And so here we are, full circle back to problems in Harris County. And for the last 3 or 4 years, as a result of the O'Donnell case, which is a case that the federal court decided you had to release more people, Harris County's been releasing virtually every misdemeanor defendant without any sort of secured bond. And not surprisingly, and the news is reflected, crime has exploded in Houston. Now, those officials who endorsed this Houston catch and release approach to law enforcement have been trying to find scapegoats for their failing program since virtually day one. At various times, the ridiculously high failure to appear rate was the fault of first Hurricane Harvey, and then it was Trump's fault, like everything else, and then it was COVID, and then George Floyd, and now it appears that the latest scapegoat is the bondsmen who were posting some of the remaining bonds, but we're extending some credit on those. And now that the increased crime can't possibly be for just letting everybody go, it's got to be that the bondsmen have extended some credit. So just let me ask you first and kind of deal with the big elephant in the room. Is the fact that bail bondsmen may be extending credit or financing their fees in any way responsible for the astronomical rise in crime in Houston and other cities that have adopted these overly lenient pretrial release policies?
Well, in short, no, it is not. And really what we've seen in Texas is we've gone to a point with O'Donnell where bail is not affordable, to the recent decision by the bail bond board to implement a 10% minimum premium to bail is too affordable. Okay, so you're extending credit to individuals on some cases larger premiums in order to facilitate their release from custody. But you know, as we see in the talking points with those that would like to end the use of cash bail, is they tend to focus on smaller things like, oh, it's making it too affordable to get out. But what they're missing in the big picture is, regardless if the bondsman charges zero or he charges the full amount of the premium prior to posting the bond, the bondsman is still, and the surety company is still liable for the full amount of the bond. So if the bondsman decides to make a judgment to take a payment plan and the bond forfeits, it's still on the bondsman to locate that individual and bring him back to court within the statutory period of time that's allowed. And failing to do so, they would have to pay the bond. So they just tend to get focused on what someone's paying versus what the bail bond actually does in terms of providing a full financial guarantee of appearance.
So, and actually you kind of touched on a couple of talking points that I had here, which is, so the amount of money that the bail bondsman collects to post the bond, is there really any correlation with that amount collected up front and what the bonding company does? I mean, the bail contract is a two-part deal. There's the bond fee, but there's also the security to make sure that defendant shows up for court. Now, even if you're extending credit on these bonds, you're still requiring things like indemnitors or some security to make sure that those people show up for court, correct?
Well, absolutely. I mean, there's an underwriting process to determine the risk and the risk of flight on any individual. And before you can even really talk about what you're going to charge and how you're going to collect that payment, you have to determine whether or not you want to assume the financial risk of seeing that this person goes to court. And what we're seeing these days is, because they are ORing a lot of low-level offenders, and then in Indiana, it might be a level 6 felony, which is the lowest felony, and they're starting to OR those individuals. So what we have in custody these days is, frankly, a lot of repeat offenders. That's our risk pool has shrunk. We no longer have the shallow end, we just have the deep end that we're swimming in. Unfortunately, it's like if you sold life insurance and you no longer had 20 somethings to 50 somethings, you now have 60 somethings to 80 somethings that you're dealing with. So you have all high risk bail. So for someone to bondsman to before they write a bond, again, before they even determine what they're going to charge, they have to determine whether or not they're even going to write the bond to begin with.
Oh, absolutely. And whenever I look at doing a bond, that's my first and primary concern over and above the fee is what are we going to use to secure this bond? How are we going to make sure you come back? We can always work out fee issues down the road if need be, but we need to make sure you're going to be back to court because that's really the pivotal issue that we're going to lose money and provide an incentive to appear in court. The other thing that you sort of brought up, and I skipped down on this, was one of the legal, I guess, constitutional arguments that's made against so-called unaffordable bail. And we just recently went through this in Kansas with the pretrial justice task force kind of reviewing things. And one of the things that they threw out there was that if bail is unaffordable, that it is de facto preventive detention. And then absent a change to the state constitution, like they did in New Jersey or New Mexico, preventive detention is illegal. So is Texas or Harris County, are they putting themselves in a position for some sort of constitutional challenge by the defendants, not necessarily just the bonding committees, but by the defendants to say that they're now being preventively detained if you're not being allowed to finance your bail premium in some fashion?
Well,
Shane, we're not lawyers, but
I was just going to say that I tend to not dive into legal conclusions, but I think generally what's going to happen is that individuals, because really probably what we've seen in Harris County, what we've seen in a lot of areas, California comes to mind, where the bonds tend to get larger if the judge thinks that they're paying less to get out, because they almost look like the premium is some type of a penalty. And if you're not, they set the bond assuming you're going to pay 10%, but if they find out you're only paying, if the market's only charging half of that down and the rest over time, then they say, well, I'm going to increase the amount of the bond to make that 5% larger, so on and so forth. So I think initially what you're going to find is that if they don't start reducing the felony bonds, that you're going to see some jail crowding. But there's also something interesting about what I'm learning in the past few days, that this rule may have an out, if you will, from the 10%. Now, let me say this: I'm for the bondsmen getting all their money up front. In a way, you could actually argue that Senator Whitmire and those on the board are really saying, "Hey, we're looking out for the bondsmen. We want to make sure they get paid up front before you post a bond." It's like, holy cow, who doesn't want to get paid all their money up front? I don't care if I'm selling TVs or bail bonds. I'd like to get paid. Who wants to track down and call everybody once a week to say, hey, your payment's due, your payment's due. So on one hand, you say, that's great, I want all my money. But if you're looking at giving people a reasonable opportunity to post bail, because sometimes the premium could be $2,000, $3,000, $5,000. And that's not always easy for people to come up with within 24, 48 hours. So, and anything else that you might buy, whether it's a vehicle or even your auto insurance, you're going to be afforded the opportunity to pay that over time. So why they choose to target those who have a constitutional right to post bail and be released pending trial, why they're targeting them to say you have to pay all your money up front, I really don't understand it, because a lot of the talking points over the last couple of years are people are innocent until proven guilty and they shouldn't have to post bail. And so now when they are required to post bail and they're given an opportunity to pay over time, they're saying, well, wait a minute, that's not right. They should have to pay all their money up front. So they're all, our opponents, if you will, are just really all over the map. We're Steady Eddie. We provide financial guarantee to produce the defendant. We charge a fee accordingly because we're assuming a financial risk. And that's what we do. And for them to keep attacking us, they have to keep changing their tactics over and over and over again. You charge too much, you charge too little, the bond's too high, the bond's too small, all these different things. They keep coming at us 50 different ways to Sunday because none of it's sticking. Because at the end of the day, people know you have a right to bail, and they also want to make sure that person appears in court to have justice carried out. So,
well, I mean, if you're talking about financing the bond premium, I know that in my business, at least 35 to 40% of the fees that we collect, they're on credit cards. So, I mean, those people are essentially already financing that through their credit card company. They're just not financing it through me. So, well, I mean,
and that's true. And ironically, I mean, this doesn't favor the defendant. Okay, to your point. Okay, I don't like to use the terms finance because bail agents don't finance. We can only, now you, like you said, if you put it on a credit card, yeah, they're charging you interest because you're going to carry that $5,000 maybe for a couple of months at 8 or 9 or 15% interest, whatever the case may be. But that's a very valid point, is that if they put it on a credit card, they're financing it. So why not allow the bail agent to finance that quote unquote finance interest free with payment terms, okay, over a period of time? So it's like I said, they're just it was interesting. I saw the same tactic. You mentioned New Jersey earlier, and we saw the same tactic in New Jersey before they introduced the constitutional amendment for preventative to expand the who can they can preventatively detain prior to trial, which is they first came out and said bail agents are letting everybody out on the, first it was you charge too much, and then the papers kept saying now you're charging too little, and these people are being released for too little money. And because the judge intended, when he set that $10,000 bonds, the judge intended for that person to pay $1,000 for that $10,000 bond. And my question is, what business is it the judges what you're charging for that bond? And why? Who's paying it? Why is that the judge's concern, how that's being paid? The judge really needs to be concerned that the person posting the bond is a solvent surety and can pay that penal amount of the bond should it come due. Okay, that's really all the judge needs to be concerned about. The judge shouldn't be concerned about how the lawyers are being paid, shouldn't be concerned about how the bail agents are being paid. So again, they're tending to get into other people's business because they have a separate agenda that they're working on. All these little comments and criticisms all lead to another agenda, which is they do not like the private sector component of the criminal justice system. They just do not like private. They want all the money for themselves. They want to handle everything indoors and within their world. And the private sector just drives them crazy that they're seeing money coming out of their system going to a private sector individual or business to pay the cost of a bail bond. Okay, they'd rather you pay pretrial fees, drug classes, or what have you, and then also ankle monitor fees. All that stuff goes to the county, or at least there's a county private sector partnership, say for instance on ankle monitor. So it just drives them absolutely crazy that the private sector is getting the 10%. And I can expand into to why my reasons for that, but you may have another question for me.
Well, let's see if we can kind of wrap up this Harris County stuff. Maybe look at some of the. You did touch on this already. Some of the positive aspects, either from the bondsman's perspective of what is essentially a price fixing regimen. You have to charge this amount, and you have to collect all that up front. What are some of the other positives we can take away? And then we can maybe touch on some of the negatives. I've got some notes here.
One of the weaknesses, Shane, in reading the affidavit that they have to produce when they post the bond, okay, that they collected the money, that who they collected the money from, what bond they're on, for what defendant are they posting bond, and their options for payment are cash, a check, a money order, a credit card, a property transfer, a property lien, and other. Okay, so what they're saying is you have to charge 10%, but you can take a lien on property to make up a portion of that 10%, or I guess all of that 10%, and then other. Now, does promissory note constitute as a method of securing the payment that's not, actually tendering cash at the time you post the bond? So what you're kind of seeing is that, and surprisingly, a bail bond board that's been established for decades doesn't really understand the actual process of posting a bail. Now, up to this point, I'm sure that anybody that was not taking the full premium up front was securing the balance with a promissory note or a real estate lien note or some type of collateral to secure that. So they've already been doing that. So in some respects, when you look into the small print, if you will, of this ruling, what has really changed? Now, they may not realize it. I may be advertising their loophole. So maybe block this out if you want to, but they're just looking at the affidavit. It clearly says, yeah, you can charge cash, but you can take a lien to cover the unpaid balance. So it's like, so it's very confusing. So you're going to see some challenges to this over the next few weeks, where the dust starts to settle and they start seeing how this is going to work and whether or not it is resulting in some what they might perceive as unexpected jail crowding, which the bail industry pretty much anticipated from this ruling.
Well, that would be one of the negatives. I mean, from a bail bond perspective, because I know that there's other places, and I actually have been on sort of a bail bond forum, and I think it was some people in Florida were talking about where their local jurisdiction required them to collect the entire premium up front in a similar manner. And they were quite happy about it. That, I mean, one of the ways that bail bondsmen compete with each other is on price. I mean, it's a fairly homogenous business. You're providing the same service, so your ability to compete, you can compete on price, you can compete on collateral, and you can compete on the level of service that you provide to the customer. And if you take price out of it, then you're reduced to competing on just those other two factors.
I'm a fan of like I said, I'm a fan of getting your money up front. It makes our bail agents more financially sound than perhaps they already are, because you're getting all your money up front. And like you said, if you take like in Indiana, it's a state law that it's a Class D felony if you charge less than the full amount of your filed rate before you post a bond and collect. So up here, we actually talked amongst our agents up here about making it to where you could extend payments in order to compete with the court's 10% bail scheme up here, deposit scheme. It was resoundingly defeated, that idea. And I put it forward as a possibility. No one wanted to do that because they all liked getting their money up front. And even if it meant writing a few less bonds, they know they're going to get paid up front. So I'm a big fan of that, because then it just reduces, then it really, it takes it to where now it's your location, like you said, your customer service, how you treat your customers, your phone number, your advertising, all these other things that are associated with the business, and not just the price. Now that's, on every other business you can think of, price is always an issue. What are you charging for that product? And we charge less, or here's the discounts. So it's almost un-American not to have that option. So if you think about it, because in everything that you buy, you can always search around for the best price. I guess it's a great gig if you can get it all your money up front, which just kind of makes this Harris County decision a little bit interesting, because they're really on it, which tells me there's another agenda. There's another thing they're working on to say, because if they're doing something on this face says, well, that's got to help the bail agents. They're getting all their money up front. How can they complain about that? Well, the people that are going to complain in the short term are the people that have to get out of jail, and the family members that have to go pay their premium. So what are they actually angling for? Are they angling for, get everybody comfortable with this 10%, and now we're going to change our law or try to introduce legislation to say 10% cash to the court is now an option, like it is in Indiana and several other states, South Carolina, Washington State. It may be in Texas and in Kansas. I'm not sure. In Kansas, if you have the 10% option, but
there's a limited number of cases that qualify for that 10% option. But even with that 10% option, which is referred to here as an ORCD bond, which is own recognizance / cash deposit, yes. It's supposed to be limited to a certain class of cases, and there's several exclusions that apply to that. And it also, you cannot be forced to utilize it. So we do have the ability to undercut that price if that's a bond option that's out there. But it's limited. But in Missouri, which right across the state line from me, their 10% option is rampant. I mean, yes. They do that all over the place in Missouri.
Yeah. And of course, it is here in Indiana. It has been for probably 50 years. They've had the 10% option. Now, this is kind of what I wanted to get back to. I mentioned earlier that it was a scheme, because I fully believe that the 10% cash option is a scheme perpetrated by the courts. Because if you just on its face, how do they come up with 10% as the cash option? I mean, why not 15%? Why not 50%? Why is it 10%? Because that's what the bail agents charge. Almost in Indiana, that's what we were charging for many, many years, is 10%. So they charge 10% because that's what the bail agent charge. And that's a direct competition with the private sector, Sherman Act violation, if I dare, walk into the legal terms, but that's always been brought up as the government competing against the private sector. And that's about as bald-faced effort as you can make to compete against the bail agents. What do you guys charge? Okay, the government's going to have its own bond, and we're going to charge the exact same thing. How about them apples? And guess what? We're going to have our booking officers telling the defendants to say, yeah, you can pay a non-refundable premium to the bail agent, and they're going to monitor you and watch you and where you go, and you have to bring family members in here. You might be humiliated a little bit because you're on your second or third DWI, or you can take option B, which is to pay 10% directly to the court. No one's going to be watching you. And hey, if you show up to court, you can get all the money back less your fines and costs. And what is not said is that if you don't show up to court, we're just going to take your 10% and no one's really going to bother you for the other 90% because they do not collect the other 90%. Okay, so that's the scheme of it all, is that it's all about collecting the cash up front, in effect escrowing your fines and costs ahead of time. So no matter what happens, if you don't show up to court, they've got their fines and costs covered, or they've got the forfeited 10% cash in the banks. And that money's just sitting in some account somewhere. And of course, in Indiana, no one really knows where that money goes, okay? Especially in a forfeited bond situation. It doesn't go to the state where criminal appearance bond forfeited bail goes to. So it's a scheme. And so again, that's them saying, we want that cash. We don't want that money going to a private sector. And we're not all concerned about whether or not anybody shows up. We're really more focused on the cash that it can generate. And when we, in 2013, Shane, we introduced legislation to say, because our law says the court cannot accept less than 10% and no more than 100% of the set cash bail amount in cash for deposit. We were trying to get that minimum increase to 15%, right?
Right.
So our argument was simply, well, if you think 10% is good, 15% is even better on your cash deposit. Well, the judges who up to that point simply said, people are coming back to court because they want their money back, finally had to fess up to the fact that, well, you know what? We really rely on that cash. We really rely on that cash to pay fines and costs. Please don't take our cash away, okay? Because that's how we fund our courts. Now, legislators saying, well, holy cow, if that's how you fund your courts, if we take that away, now the state's going to have to help you fund your courts. So then all of a sudden we were in that situation because they raised so much money on cash bail. Now it becomes a state problem as opposed to the courts trying to fund themselves through these cash deposits.
Well, and that was sort of a question that I had, and this was one of the things that these bail reform lawsuits that have sprung up all across the country, in attacking bail, seem to have stumbled over themselves on. In New Orleans, it seems to apply directly to Indiana. In New Orleans, there's a setup where the bondsmen can charge their 10%, but they're supposed to charge an extra 2% of the bond on top of that, and that 2% goes directly to fund the courts. Well, these bail reform lawsuits, and I don't know if it was EJL or who it was that initiated this, but there was a lawsuit against New Orleans courts attacking them for that, saying you need to refund that money. And I don't think they end up winning on that. But the court determined that the 2% funding the courts directly, they didn't make this ruling specifically, but it was referenced in the case that was probably a constitutional violation because you no longer had a free and fair arbiter. The arbiter, that is the courts, had an interest in how much the bond was set at because some percentage of that bond went to fund their courts. Now, that was not the ruling in the case, so it's not necessarily an on-point case, but they essentially laid that out to the Louisiana state legislatures. You might want to consider changing this because this is looking awfully unconstitutional to us. And when you look at that, one of the other states that does that uses that money directly to help finance the courts is the state of Indiana. I mean, is Indiana putting, again, we're getting into more lawyer type questions, but
No.
are they not putting themselves in that same sort of situation where they have a vested interest in how much they're setting the bond at because it generates revenue for them?
Well, well, that's exactly right. I mean, again, they were forced to, thinking that they were going to lose on that bill because we were making the case that, well, 15% is more than 10%. How can you not want more cash? When they finally had to come out of the closet, if you will, and say, okay, all right, we do need the cash. It's not necessarily because the people show up to court more because of these cash deposits. We need the cash. And so, and then they know enough legislators. And again, legislators are probably looking at the big picture. Yeah, I know they got a lot of people not showing up to court, but if we take away their way to fund their courts, now we've got to fund it as the state. And so that's a big problem in Indiana. And the challenge is, how do we convince legislators that it's better off making sure people go to court than whether or not you're saving a few bucks because the court's funding their, themselves with cash. So, it's a problem. It's interesting that, just a quick story, if you will, when we were out in Oregon this would have been about 10 years ago, probably longer than that, when we were trying to get bail restarted in Oregon. We were sitting around a whole group of agency officials, court clerks and judges and prosecutors and county attorneys and everything. And we're talking about, they have 10% bail up there too. And they came out and basically said that the 10% funds their courts. When they're talking about introducing surety back into it, again, they were bemoaning the fact that, well, if you introduce surety, then we're gonna have a lot less cash available to us from this 10%. And what came out of that conversation was how many different entities within the criminal justice system up there actually had their hands in that pot, getting the cash out for this program or that program, or helping me pay for another clerk in my office or whatever. That how many people that agencies relied on that cash, because they created a new revenue stream. And it's like, holy cow, this is like manna from heaven, all this money just coming in here, and we don't have any responsibilities. We're not penalized if someone doesn't show up to court. It's just free money. I mean, who's gonna not want free money? They're just they're somewhat capitalist without the risk. They want the money, but they don't want the risk. So it's a challenge to try to fight that and convince legislators that, bail is about appearance. Bail is not about securing fines and costs. Okay, so we have to get back to what the true purpose of bail is, which is to make sure people show up to court, and the victims of crime are getting justice. Now, if they're guilty or not guilty, that's up for the judge and the jury. But the reality is they have to be there to make that determination. So crime victims are the ones that are really getting a raw deal in these systems.
I want to touch just one little more thing. And again, I know that I go more into the lawyer type questions, but I was reading your blog from January, and let me just kind of quote one of the deals that says the Ohio Supreme Court came to the same conclusion in State versus State X Rel Jones v. Hendon. Once a judge chooses that condition and sets the amount of bond, we find no legitimate purpose in further specifying the form of bond which may be posted. Indeed, the only apparent purpose in requiring a cash-only bond, to the exclusion of other forms provided, is to restrict the accused access to a surety, and thus to detain the accused in violation of Section 9, Article 1. And we found such a practice inappropriate. Now, as that relates to deposit bonds, this was an argument that I made, and since it was an argument I made many, many years ago, I'm still fond of it, was that 10% deposit bonds were on their face excessive bail, because the court has already made a determination that only 10% of that bond is required to assure the defendant's appearance in court. Why shouldn't the defendant then be allowed to use a surety to post that 10% amount if that's really all that's required to guarantee their appearance in court? Now, again, I'm not a lawyer, and so my argument doesn't carry a whole lot of weight, but that was an argument I made when we were fighting 10% bonds here in Kansas, 20 some years ago. But it still seems to me like it resonates. If you're going to say that this is the only amount that's necessary, why should the defendants then be required to sit in custody and not have the availability of a surety post that bond?
Well, Shane, that's a brilliant argument. I've used that many times myself, because what we come to call that up here, a 10% cash option, is the 90% discount.
Right.
So you set bail at 10,000, and immediately you set a 10% cash option. So now the bond is really $1,000 cash and 10,000 surety. So why then, if surety is the same as cash, because it's a financial guarantee, why then couldn't you use a surety bond to post amount equal to the 10% amount? Then it becomes even more affordable to the defendant. Now they're paying, if you're using 10% as the premium, now you're paying $100 for that $1,000 cash bond, right? And when the bond was originally 10,000, it just, which I made that argument several times, like you, to our legislators, is it's a fraud on the public when the news reports that so-and-so was released on $100,000 bond, when in fact it was a 10% cash bond, and they put up $10,000 with the court. So there's nobody, and like cash, unlike surety, cannot guarantee someone shows up to court. Okay, if that person fails to appear, there's nobody producing that individual to make sure they show up to court. So, to my point, when you brought up the Ohio case, was that in Indiana, it's not the defendant's choice. The law says that you could put up, your options are full cash, real estate, a bail bond, or 10% cash option. Okay. But in Indiana, the judge can decide which of those they're going to allow you to post. Okay. So he sets a $10,000 bond. He's going to say, surety's not an option. You can only put 10% cash, or you can only post full cash. So we've been arguing for defendant's choice for many years now in Indiana. Unfortunately, we've not succeeded, but that's the reason for pointing out that case in Ohio. And there's also one in, I think, in Florida and Washington, and probably several others, but that's just as far as my research took me, that the judge is there to determine bail based on the defendant's risk of flight, risk to public safety, prior criminal history, and the seriousness of offense that they're being charged with at that moment. Not to decide, okay, I'm going to set bail, and then I'm going to tell you how you're going to make that bail. Okay, it's like, I'm going to sell you a car, and then I'm going to tell you how you're going to pay for it, as opposed to having the option of leasing or putting up full cash or getting a loan. You have a judge saying, I'm going to dictate to you how you're going to pay that bond, which is flat out wrong. And of course, the Ohio decision, in my view, got it right. Set the bail and let me worry about how I'm going to post my bail. Thank you very, very much, Judge. So there's a couple things in there, defendant's choice on how I'm going to post it. And if they're setting a cash option, 10% cash option, you should be able to post a bail bond on that lower cash amount, because that's really the true bail being set, is a 10% cash option. So in Michigan, as you may be aware, several years ago, they made it to where if the judge sets a $10,000 bond, now follow this, if the judge sets a $10,000 bond with a 10% cash option, a bail agent can actually go in and post a surety bond equal to 25% of the bond. Okay, so I know it sounds weird, but that's what and it seems to work up there. It's like the original bond only accounts for how to calculate how you're going to post a lesser amount of the bond. So it's very bizarre, but that's what Michigan was able to get past. So even a 25% surety bond is still going to be more affordable to the defendant than putting up 10% cash, 10% of the original bond. I guess that was their thinking behind it. But at the end of the day, let me leave, and I'll answer all the questions you have for me. But again, 10% cash is the scheme. It's favorable to the court, not to the defendant, not to the crime victims. It's the court that really walks away the winner here, because they get their fines and costs secured to a cash escrow, this 10% bail. And plain and simple, that's all it is simple greed by the court. It's really could be considered unjust enrichment, because they're using bail to fund their courts as opposed to guarantee the appearance of the defendant in court.
Well, and it absolutely is government math. And, you sit there, and I had a judge come up and talk about how their 10% program was making money, but what they didn't factor in was the cost of the the interviewee, the pretrial detention officers that were doing the interviews. They didn't factor the cost of the buildings they were working in. They didn't factor the cost of the offices. They didn't factor any of the costs that any normal business would have to associate with making money. But they were making money just because, hey, we got this revenue stream that came in. But that very much is typical.
It also doesn't factor in the cost that when the defendant fails to appear, let's say for trial, you've had the prosecutor, the judge, you've reserved court time for that individual to be in court. You've impaneled the jury. You've done all this work and gone to all this expense, and the person doesn't show up to court. All that money is wasted. And there's no on a cash bond. There's no one out looking for this person because you're in Kansas City. If you're like Indianapolis, at any given time you have 50,000 outstanding felony warrants, and so it's not like the law enforcement is dropping everything that they're doing so they can go look at somebody that's failed to appear for DWI with injury or something like that. Okay, so that's why bail agents are motivated, quite simply because we don't want to lose money, and we want to provide a good service to the community by making sure that these individuals get to court, and just collaterally the victims of crimes are benefited, and society is benefited, and when the agent performs, they make money. But you have to perform to make money. And the premium's not earned until the defendant appears in court.
Well,
back to the Harris County issue.
Well, right. Let me touch on deposit bonds here, and then we'll see if we can't just wrap this up.
Sure.
One of the points that I had in my notes here was a comparison that the federal government actually did in the Bureau of Justice Statistics report that I know we've all seen, but compared deposit bonds to surety bonds in both failure to appear rate and amount. And some of the things you've touched on are backed by federal statistics, so they know these things. Deposit bonds are basically set an amount to twice the amount of surety bonds, and they're set that way because the judge knows they're not really guaranteeing anything, and so they have to be higher. And deposit bonds have a failure to appear rate that's about 25% higher. And the fugitive rate, meaning the people that are still missing after a year, is more than twice that of surety bail. So the amount of money that you're posting is not encompass everything that the bonding company does. The bonding company's got to do lots more things, and these deposit bonds don't really work at the core thing that bail is supposed to do.
Okay.
Go ahead. No, go ahead.
I was just to say to your point, running a bail agency is not unlike running any other business. Okay, if you walk away with 20% after your expenses, you're probably doing pretty good because you have your surety cost, you have your advertising costs, your building, your staffing, all these expenses that you have. So if you've got an individual that's failed to appear on a $10,000 forfeited bond that you've made $200 on in a 10% premium environment, that you've netted $200, that's what you have at stake, a $10,000 potential loss. And if you pay that $10,000 loss, how much business you have to generate just to get reimburse yourself for a $10,000, that's whole dollars, that's $10,000 loss that you've got to generate to make up for that loss. That's why bail agents cannot afford to take losses, okay? At least not extensively, and certainly not more than a few a year, because it takes so much. Now, yes, if you've secured your bond properly and you have proper indemnitors, or you've secured real estate, there is a pathway to try to subrogate and get your money back, but that's not always as easy as we'd like it to be. So it's a risk business, and that's why it goes back to, if I can get all my money up front and every time I post a bond, then I'm going to be doing cartwheels, because that would be fantastic. But unfortunately, that's not the real world. It's not we live in America where you have payment options on just about everything that you purchase, and whether you use a credit card or you just have a payment plan. So the idea that you cannot obtain your freedom, your constitutional right to freedom pending trial, and not be able to have that opportunity to make some of these larger premium payments over time is just really ridiculous. And it really is a negative impact on the person, on the accused, and again, the family and their support system trying to get them out. So you rest assured, or know this, that there's a larger agenda here for those that are pushing this 10% minimum, and that is likely to introduce legislation in Texas that will allow the court to take 10%. And then all of a sudden, it's going to sound like a great idea that they have to pay money to get out of jail, because now the court's making money. So there's a larger agenda here, because what they've done on its face doesn't make a whole lot of sense, and that usually is a telltale sign that they've got something bigger planned than that. Just this. There's 254 counties in Texas. We're talking about one county. This is really a local turf war in Harris County, but it is something that everybody is watching to see what happens, because you might see some other counties in Texas say, well, we should be doing that as well if Houston is doing it. So we'll be watching very closely.
Well, I read something a while back that when you're trying to determine what the actual agenda of a plan is, you should look at the results of that plan, not what the people pushing it claim the agenda is. And so in this situation, you have jail population is going to increase if you put this in place.
Yes.
And the same people that were making this argument 6 months ago, where the jail population increase was bad, that was terrible. But now we have to increase jail population because this other thing's bad.
Like I said earlier, that Senator Whitmire, who was at the hearing and pushing this 10%, because I think he wants to run for mayor of Houston. He's in his last year. This is his last session at the state. He was at the State House on legislation. He was saying how bail was unaffordable and you shouldn't have to post bail to get out. And now he's saying that you should have to pay full premium before you get out. So, politicians, they can just play both sides. They can talk out of both sides of the mouth all the time, and you just never really know what the issue is. But rest assured that there's that old saying that, follow the money. There's something in it for them at some point, whether it's the 10% cash option plan or something, where there's a way for them to make money somehow, or gain power, one of those two.
Yeah, money and power are always the things to look at.
Yeah, exactly. So
well, let's wrap it up here. I know that I always did hate it when old bail bondsmen would tell stories about the old days. And so as I'm getting to be an older bail bondsman, I find myself doing that a little bit more. But back when I was 24 years old, I was at the Kansas legislature for my very first time, trying to fight off an attempt to implement a statewide 10% deposit program. There was a county in the state that had done that, and they were trying to push it to go statewide. And I had written up this 40-page written document for my testimony, and I had it ready to hand out and talk about it. And of course, I know, what I do now is that, not a single soul read that document. And I really didn't get to talk. But a Whitlock actually showed up and testified on behalf of that, actually in opposition to that bill. And he came in and dominated that committee hearing. He was confident. He had command of the topic. And it was really impressive to watch him work. And he won, I think single-handedly pushed that bill to not go through. And so I just want to thank you for taking the time today to talk to us. I want to thank you and your family for all of the stuff that you've done over the years to help keep bail in business. Because at the time I was 24 years old, that was 32 years ago. So I wouldn't still be in the business had your father not been there to help support the bail bond industry in the state of Kansas when they were under pressure. And we do really appreciate you and people like you making those efforts to keep the industry itself, safe and whole nationwide. And these battles seem to crop up all the time. And I appreciate everything you do. And I really do appreciate the time you took to talk to us today.
I appreciate you having me on, Shane.
Thank you, Mike. And hopefully we'll do this again in the future sometime.
Absolutely. Anytime.
Thank you for joining us today on the Bail in the Midwest podcast.